Welcome back, everyone. Our final panel discussion today explores the complex and often contentious topic of open borders, migration, and labor markets. This session will examine the arguments surrounding migration, its impact on labor markets, and the case for more liberal border policies. Moderating this crucial discussion is Sven Gerst. Sven is a philosopher of liberalism and political economist. His academic work and research interests directly engage with the themes of this panel, specifically including global justice and the ethical case for open borders. Having previously delivered lectures on this very topic and acknowledging the practical dimensions involved in moving towards more liberal border policies, Sven is exceptionally well suited to guide this conversation. Joining the panel is Deanna. Deanna serves as the Director of Workforce Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. Her role at PPI, an influential policy organization, provides her with direct expertise on labor market dynamics, employment trends, skills development, and other workforce issues that are central to understanding the economic impacts of migration. Next, we have Marcin Zielinski, President of the Board and Chief Economist at the Civic Development Forum, a prominent free market think tank in Poland. Poland's recent experiences with significant migration flows, both emigration after joining the EU and large-scale immigration, particularly from Ukraine, makes his perspective highly relevant to the discussions of migration's real-world effects on labor markets and the economy. And our final speaker is Harrison Griffiths. Harrison is the International Programs Manager at the Institute of Economic Affairs, the well-known free market think tank based in the UK. Harrison frequently writes and provides commentary on a wide array of policy issues from a classical liberal viewpoint. He has a particular interest in migration policy, having authored numerous articles and commentary pieces analyzing UK migration trends, challenging common criticisms, and advocating for liberal approaches. Please welcome our panel for open borders, migration, and labor markets.
Okay, welcome everybody, and it's a great pleasure for me to moderate this very timely discussion. Let's see, I prepared a little poll in the beginning. Let's see whether we can just put it on the screen, and we wanted to do a little room check of how we feel about the topic of open borders at its current place. So let me see whether this is technologically possible to just put the slide in the background. If that's not possible, I will do it by the show of hands. Okay, but cool. Now you can't even see the options, but okay. Let's give it, I will verbalize it for you and I guide you through, so let's all pay attention. Go to on your smartphones to the website menti.com. So you go on your smartphones to the website menti.com. Okay, and then it should ask you about a room code, and there you plug in the number 25323833. Unfortunately, that cannot be displayed here, but 25323833. It works? Perfect. Then I give it one last round so that everybody can connect. Menti.com, here is the room code 25323833. Well, as you can see, I studied many years of philosophy to read out numbers. Huh? But, well, the question that I posed for you was, should liberals uphold the ideal of open borders? And I gave you a couple of options. One is like, hell yeah, so yes. One is no. The other one is not sure, and the last one, that was not our ideal in the past anyways. So let's see how the numbers will plug out, and in the meanwhile I will explain why I'm asking this question. The number? Okay, one last time, otherwise people are missing out. I hope you can plug in the number. I don't see anything actually. 25323833. Does it work for those? Can you Paul? Like, you already did? Okay, I would be very curious because we don't see any results here. That's not very dynamic. Okay. It's refreshing. But I have, oh, we see the polling coming out. Okay, so the refreshing shows 35, 36 for yes, 9 for no, 14 for not sure, and 2, well, that was never our ideal anyways. So I give you a little bit of context why I'm asking this question. Because roughly 10 to 12 years ago, I also, in the starting parts of my connection with the liberty movement, I wrote an essay called The Ethical Case for Open Borders. And at that time, I felt that open borders was really permeating like the liberal movement. We made a very strong case for the open borders case. But it was when populism was not so much around as it is today. And I feel tides have changed, and I felt that in the classical liberal/libertarian movement, the debate about open borders became not only morally but strategically under attack. So that's something we will discuss, how the zeitgeist, as we Germans say, has turned, whether we should accommodate here or whether we should keep the ideal case of open borders with us. And besides this philosophical discussion, we then will look at 3 different labor markets and the impacts of immigration in Poland, in the UK, and of course, very contagiously today, the United States, where Donald Trump made this the centerpiece of his so-called administration. So let me see the final this polling. 37 say, well, we are the open borders crowd, 9 skeptical, 14 not so sure, and only 2% dispute whether this has ever been part of the liberal agenda. So let me throw that, and after all that yapping now, to the panel. What do you think? On a philosophical level, should we still be committed to the open borders case? So I would start maybe with the United States, where this is, I think, very prominent. Should open borders be still something that we classical liberals, libertarians should uphold?
So I think this is a question that both Republicans and Democrats in the US are sort of trying to figure out right now in general. More so, I know kind of the Democratic Party perspective a little bit more, and so I'll speak a little bit about that. Right now, we kind of have this question at the central, is in a central position within sort of like infighting in the party, is how open should our borders be, especially after we very notably lost the election. I think you have one party within the Democratic Party that says we are the United States and we should always allow immigrants into our country because they make our country what it is. And then we have, but we need kind of, legal pathways to do so. And then there's the other more progressive side of the party that argues for open borders with very few regulations. Progressive Policy Institute, where I am at right now, is a center-left think tank. And I have worked with immigration, migration policy more in the lens of workforce development. I would say right now we have seen a lot of backlash to some of our previous immigration policies. In 2022, the foreign-born population within the US reached a record of 47.8 million, and that was the highest it had been in, I think, over 20 years, since the early 2000s. And a lot of polling data suggests that Americans and also immigrants who came to the US with legal pathways were unapproving of some of the more liberal immigration policies that were in place within the United States. So I think that would be my answer.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very much at the heart of the populist backlash to a certain degree that maybe we have oversteered in terms of the open borders agenda. Although, as somebody who comes from it from a moral perspective, there has never been such as, like very much open borders policies amongst any administration, right? But nevertheless, we see the populist backlash then fully going and rolling these back, and we saw that with the Trump administration. So now, Harrison, in the UK, you come out of the Brexit debate, labor market and migration policy very much now has to be adjusted, now with the fully recaptured sovereignty, one must say. How are things over there? But besides we go into the labor market in the UK, from the open borders perspective, is it something to campaign on for classical liberals, libertarians in the UK, or do you think, okay, that's something that needs to go on the back burner or we need to rethink?
Yeah, there definitely needs to be a rethink. So I think you've seen in the United States a backlash to something that liberal open borders advocates would consider to be quite tame. The US has never had an open border, nothing close to it. But you've seen the sense of lawlessness that people have in response to Joe Biden's border policies that convinced a lot of people who weren't necessarily Trumpian, populist, anti-immigration, racist, anything like that, to vote for Trump in opposition to that. And we would consider that a fairly mild sort of openness of borders. You're seeing it in the UK as well. Since Brexit, which many people consider to have been a vote against the open borders within the European Union, you've seen a massive increase in net migration in the UK, an increase that has come disproportionately from the old British Commonwealth into the UK and not so much anymore people coming in from the European Union. And that has generated an awful lot of backlash. You've seen the small boats crisis in the UK, people, mostly refugees, coming over on inflatable boats across the English Channel. It's contributed again to that similar sense of lawlessness. People are not happy with it. And so I have been convinced for a while now, mostly by Tyler Cowen and Matthew Feeney actually from Big Brother Watch in the UK, that open borders is a route to a massive fascist backlash. And I think we've seen a relatively tame immigration openness, or at least lack of control in the US and the UK, that shows us that if you go any further, people are not ready to come with you yet. So morally speaking, I am 100% pro-open borders. I think it's an inalienable right of individuals to cross lines, own property, do business, as long as they are not infringing on anybody else's liberty. I totally support that. I think economically speaking, the potential growth and human development that we are missing out on from having closed borders is enormous. Most people disagree with me. Most people disagree with me strongly. So it's definitely not something you should campaign on. However, I think that just because we're under the cosh doesn't mean that we should abandon immigration as an issue. Yeah. I think in the UK, I think in the US to some extent, where I'm a bit more familiar with the policy discussion than elsewhere, the case for immigration is being made by people who are not selling it well and are making outdated arguments about immigration. I think we need to reframe the immigration discussion in a more humanitarian way, in a more economic way, and stop with the old Blairite, well, we would say Blair-era talking points in the UK about immigration and reframe the discussion. We've got a lot of work to do if we want to convince people to have a more open mind to immigration. Open borders is for the birds. That's not a discussion we can have seriously in, any time, probably in my lifetime, never mind anybody else's.
I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the debate about globalization, right? Where to a certain degree, especially classical liberals, libertarians always said, well, globalization creates so many benefits for all over the place. And there are a couple of losers, well, okay, we could compensate them. Well, we saw politically where these couple of losers ended out. It's the heart of the MAGA movement, right, so to speak. So I think politics kicks in harder than sometimes we wish for. But maybe there's a more hopeful view. So Marcin, I let you sit there throughout these remarks. And I know you might have a very different perspective. So how would you see that? Where is the future of the liberal movement on the topic of open borders, speaking about your Polish experience?
Okay, first, I want to comment on what you said. They don't have to be losers. Many people think they are losers, but in fact they are not losers. Like, the same as in Poland after the transition that began in late 1980s and early 1990s. Now, like GDP per capita in Poland is 3 times higher than it was in 1989, and you still have people in Poland that claim that they are losers because of transition. There's no way, and there is a lot of data that shows that in every income percentile, people earn more now than in 1990. Still, you have people who think they are losers. So.
Just before we move on, I think that's fully right, but politically we always have to think about the complexity of issues, right? And I think even if people are not worse off absolutely, they are worse off relatively, right? So there's relative status loss. Maybe I was the dominant class, like whatever class, or I had a specific social status, and that social status has been decreased, even though my level absolutely is better off, right? And I think that's something of the complexity of especially politics, where it is about status, that we have to consider. But now let's focus again on the open borders question and your Polish experience.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Of course. So first, I personally, I am a supporter of open borders, perhaps with some reservations, but generally I'm in favor of open borders migration policy. Or let me say, I'm against migration policy. I would like to remind the words of Gary Becker, the Nobel laureate in economics, who said once that the best industrial policy is none at all. And the same is with migration policy, I think. Like whenever the politicians start any policy, create some document to implement it, it's getting worse. In fact, in Poland, we never had open borders. Like we have had, of course, open borders as a member of the EU, but we had no open borders for foreigners from other countries. But still, we had rather liberal approach to migration. Unfortunately, it starts to change, and here is why I am against migration policy. I remember in December I spoke with some economist from the US, and he told me it was like 2 or 3 months after publication of official migration strategy by Polish government, and he told me that you had a very good approach to migration. Poland is a success story, and now you are going to screw it up, and that's true. So, and what is funny that many pro-market liberal economists wanted migration policy. It was like the problem in Poland is that we have many labor regulations that are very absurd and obsolete. For example, they were introduced 20 or 30 years ago when we had very high unemployment. So, for example, if you want to hire a migrant in Poland from the non-EU country, you have to get a note from the local government that you are not able to hire a native person on that post. But and we should remove it. It was absurd even 20 years ago when we had a high unemployment, but at least it had some justification at the face of it. But now it's of course. So some liberals wanted the migration policy, and they claimed let's have a migration policy to get rid of all those obsolete and absurd regulations. And I'm afraid what we are going to experience now is the old saying that be careful what you wish for, because now we have a migration policy which is a document on migration strategy which is very against migrations, and with many new bad ideas on new regulations in that area.
Okay, so if I summarize the first kind of approach, when we discuss on the topic whether we should have open borders on the agenda for classical liberals, libertarians, well, probably we all agree that it is kind of a background ideal with some hesitation that exactly politics makes it very tricky at the moment, and the zeitgeist seems to have turned. But nevertheless, besides this philosophical ideal, we have demographics and we have the labor markets, where immigration is a crucial part. So I ask each of you quickly to give us a little bit of background on what is the current state of the economy in the labor market in your respective country, and what the impact of the need for immigration might look like, because in the 3 different countries it might look quite differently, and then we take it from there, because I think that is the case that liberals can anchor to actually make the economy's future ready based on the labor market needs that we have respectively. So we start again with the United States because of course one of the most interesting cases, because the harsh crackdown of the US administration on immigration seems to have impact on the labor market, and we already hear the first reports that highly skilled laborers that don't get access to the green cards that they would need. So how is the current shape of the labor market panning out, and what do you prospect in terms of the impact of this rollback of harsh immigration policy in terms of future readiness of the labor market, Deanna?
Sure. So, long story short, America needs immigrants in order for our economy to be strong.
But your president doesn't want.
No, but I mean, to me, that's nonsensical. That makes no sense. The economic case, kind of the labor market case for having immigrants, we have an aging population in the United States, we call the baby boomers, and we simply do not have enough workers in younger generations to support that aging population. And right now, immigrants and their children are projected to add 18 million people to the working age to fill jobs. We're seeing all sorts of crazy things about deportation, about temporary TPS, temporary protective status being kind of done away with, green cards being more restricted. And we have a large share of what we would consider to be low-skill labor in the United States that are currently being done by immigrants, whether they are legal or illegal in the eyes of the United States. 5% of our labor force right now is undocumented immigrants. They are largely in agriculture, food supply, construction, industries that are really, really, really important to the everyday lives of Americans. And simply put, if you get rid of them, we have huge problems. And I don't think that there has been any sort of strategy or discussion about what would happen, truly what would happen if those people were to go away overnight.
But let me ask just directly a follow-up, because it seems to me staggering. Like, on the one side, I hear from the so-called administration that they want to have also the reshoring of industries, right, to re-industrialize the United States, which comes with a significant amount of increase in labor force. So, like, how do they think about the future readiness of that labor market when they want to re-industrialize the United States? If they want to manufacture these iPhones back home, I mean, obviously they will not do that, but you get my metaphor here, right? And like, if I hear that seems that this problem that you just outlined will just amplify to the max. Will they ease out of the migration question? We heard it from Johan in the morning. Like, this whole it's almost contradictory to a certain degree to be anti-trade and anti-immigration. You're like really hurting yourself double, like, so to speak.
I agree completely. I mean, I think I live in Washington, D.C. I think a large majority of people in Washington, D.C. think that the policies are simply bad, that they don't make sense. I mean, I'm not going to put up a fight for like this current administration's policies. I don't think they make sense from a moral standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a labor market standpoint. What we're seeing happening with the tariffs that are coming down now, there's not really, the algorithms don't really make any sort of sense, the way they're doing the calculations. They'll affect workers here. The common man in America or woman will be affected by those tariffs in a way that the current administration has not or will not accept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, the most staggering thing seems that nevertheless immigration policy is where he's most popular on, if you just look at the polling data, right? So besides all of the economic impact that we will see further down the line, I think that is still the polls, and it seems like he's reigning by the polls anyways, the one where he sees, okay, the most uptick. Let's explore it further in just a second, but let's look at the UK now. What is the current state of the labor market? We heard now from the US a very grave picture, not very future ready, it seems to me. How is it post-Brexit? Is it a good case?
Yes, so I'll open it in, well, no. But also, yes.
I was there, you caught me off guard for a second. But
Yeah, very, very complicated picture. I mean, I'll open my bit here in much the same way, is to say that Britain does need immigration. We have 840,000 job vacancies in the UK. We have long-term unemployment among people between the ages of 16 and 64 in the UK, up 25% since 2019. Those 840,000 vacant jobs in the UK, that's up from a rolling average of about 700,000 between 2015 and 2019. Where are most of these shortages? Tends to be healthcare, health and social care, logistics like truck drivers and things like that. These areas have kind of acute shortages, which, to be fair, most visas issued in the UK do go towards. It's about 75% of visas issued in the UK go towards people working in what we call shortage occupations, right? So, to be clear, there is a need, and most of the immigration is going towards satisfying that need. And if there's one thing that I think you could say generally in favour of the British immigration system, is that post-Brexit, it is quite employer-led, it is quite market-led, just in the sense that businesses who require workers from a shortage will kind of post those jobs. About 30% of employers who are members of the Confederation for British Industry, the kind of trade organisation of industry in the UK, say that they can't find British workers for certain high-skilled jobs, right? So the demand is there, industry makes it known, and generally the government responds to it. But go on.
Yeah, just to follow up there. So what you're saying is, to a certain degree, we see the things that we want to see, like complementary of workforce, or don't we? Because that's in theory what we aim for, and we saw that in like, especially for the case for open borders, what you want to have in such a labor market is that the immigration is complementing the domestic workforce, either by not meeting the low-skilled labor because they don't have the language requirement, or the very high-skilled labor force.
Right, yes. So it is only a sort of slightly market-led thing. It is still highly top-down, highly bureaucratized, and that there isn't enough of it going round. However, I think when you talk about immigrants coming into a country and being complementary to the workforce, what that means exactly is not known. Anybody who knows their Hayek knows that this is incredibly dispersed information across an economy, and that information that's highly dispersed across the economy is best communicated through price mechanisms, through people actually acting in the world and interacting between each other, trading between each other, and producing the information that comes from the price system. It cannot be known to a central planner, it cannot be known to a government. And here is where the real problem does come in with immigration in the UK, is because immigrants, unfortunately we've seen this huge increase in net immigration post-Brexit. That's partly due to a more liberal system. It's also partly due to humanitarian programs we have, so Ukrainians coming to the UK, Hong Kongers coming to the UK as well. We basically opened our border to a lot of Hong Kongers after the Chinese absorbed it in the late 2010s. Now, they've come in at that time when the UK's general economic setup is becoming increasingly unsustainable, where you have productivity sapping problems in the UK, where you can't build anything, key infrastructure, housing, when you have a tax system in the UK that discourages wealth creation and is heavily bent towards the top of the distribution. 10% of taxpayers pay about 60% of income tax in the UK. And this has created a situation where it's easier to paint immigrants as a strain on the economy because they are consuming resources that are increasingly fixed because government policy doesn't allow them to grow. So you're seeing the benefits of immigration diminished, you're seeing the costs, the so-called costs of immigration increase, and this is becoming a big problem because immigrants are the easiest to scapegoat when things like this happen. And that's where the dire situation is in the UK. And there's also just one final note I'll touch on about law and order. Law and order in the UK is going down the drain. The enforcement of, actual crimes in the UK as opposed to, tweeting bad things is not adequate. Things like theft is not prosecuted adequately. Assaults on the person, sexual assault, not policed adequately. And unfortunately, you have certain immigrants coming over who commit those crimes at a high level who are not being tackled and are not being deported, and that makes it so much easier for the nativists to pin that on all immigrants. And so if these policies change in the UK, we will start to see the true benefits of immigration. The because the UK economy is failing on so many levels, it is so easy to scapegoat the immigrants. We see this in the United States as well to some extent, and that's why the picture is quite dire at the moment.
Well, at least there's a little bit of hope knowing the UK scene a little bit. Our good friend Sam Bowman and others, they are doing their best to unleash at least a little bit of that productivity back so that Britain gets back on track. And I saw he was invited to Downing 10. So at least there are some hopes. I'm not sure I put a lot of stock on the Starmer government, but let's hope. Which stock I would put more money on is the Polish stock, because if I would have invested in Poland, I would be not a philosopher anymore. Then I could retire and really think properly on in my residency back home. Because if I look at economic growth rates, Poland looks very remarkable. But you don't seem to be making that case for Poland here. So what I wanted to ask you is the labor market. How does it look like at the moment? The economy in Poland is still projecting strong.
I thought you were talking about Polish stock market, which is
No. Poland as a country.
Yeah, Poland. So yeah, that's true that Polish economy has been growing very rapidly since 1992. I think it was the first year of growth after the so-called transition recession, which happened in every post-socialist country in Europe and Asia. It was very short in Poland, and then we started growing. It lasted till 2020, and then because of COVID, we had some decrease in GDP. But now our economy is still growing, and what is important, it's not growing because of very good economic policy. We have so many burdens for the economy, like a very huge state-controlled sector in Poland. Like half of the banking sector is state-controlled. And we need privatization. We need true deregulation in Poland. We need so many things, but we don't have them. But we have migrants, and what is important, the influx of migrants from Ukraine started not in 2022 when the full-scale invasion on Ukraine began, but it started in 2014 when with the annexation of Crimea. And many Ukrainians came to Poland to work here, and the employment rate among them was impressive, like 93%.
That is insane.
93% of them were employed. Now with refugees, and most of them are women with young children or old people, the employment rate among the Ukrainian population in Poland is higher than among Polish population, adjusted for the age structure. So it's really impressive. And so it's still funny that we have some, in many Western countries, people are against migration because they see migrants coming to take some benefits from the state and not to work. In Poland, it's not true. They come to work here, and still they come to your country to take benefits and still to take and to steal your job. So it's contradictory, but
the Schrödinger's migrant, the meme, right? To a certain degree. But let me just ask directly on the Ukrainians, what made them so employable? Because of course we have influx from refugees all over Europe, and some countries react more resilient or more adaptable to these kind of regimes. What made the Polish success story in that case?
I think that the one reason is the lack of benefits that would allow them to live from that money. There are some benefits, but they are not enough to live from them. So you need to work, and they really work.
So it's a little bit like the old Milton Friedman argument that the migration and the welfare state to a certain degree are at tension with each other, and we have to cancel that out.
Although he did make that argument in favour of more illegal immigration, to be fair. You should always read the sentence after that in the Friedman quote. He said he should support more illegal immigration because they can't claim welfare, so you know.
Yeah. I always say it's actually a great case to reform the welfare state rather than the migration system.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%.
But let me also speak about Polish labor market, because
please.
we have the same problem as the United States, the UK, and many other Western countries, that the Polish population ages and is going to age very rapidly in next decades. So to compare Poland with other EU members now, Polish population is one of the youngest in the EU, but in 3 decades, in 30 years, it is going to be one of the oldest. We are going to age more rapidly than other Western countries, and that's why we need more migrants. We have lower retirement age than most Western countries. It's 65 for men, 60 for women is the lowest retirement age for women in the whole EU. And people are against rising the retirement age. And of course, who is going to work for them? Like, we need people who are going to contribute to the pension scheme, for sure. And it's still really crazy that now the government that claims that it is not going to rise the retirement age, and I think that unfortunately it is going to hold its promise in this area, is also against migration. Like, how is it going to work in, not now, but in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades? And according to every research, every forecast of economic growth in Poland, for last 30 years, Poland was growing faster than Western countries, for example, than Germany, and it's like catching up with the West. But in the next 30 years, we are going to lag behind the Western countries because of the aging, very rapidly aging population, and also because other obstacles, as for example, large share of state-controlled enterprises.
Yeah, so I see a common theme almost emerging. Like, all societies and all labor markets, based on their actually very distinct features, need migration, and on the other side, it's politically undesirable to have migration. So we are again in a kind of a pickle here. But nevertheless, I asked each of you to maybe think about one thing from the migration systems that you would say is a good practice, or is at least something positive to highlight in your respective countries. I don't know who wants to give it a go for the first. Like, Deanna, you're already shaking your head, but maybe there's a best practice in terms of migration policies that we can share in these dire times for the open borders crowd. Who wants to give it a first go?
I would like to not go first.
Okay. Harrison, please.
As I said, I think one of the few things that I would say in favour of the British immigration system is that it is, compared to a lot of other countries, slightly more market-led in terms of the way that it formulates its shortage occupations and facilitates the arrival of people who do tick all the boxes for shortage occupations. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay, as good as we go. Maybe Marcin then, and then we close with Deanna. So
Let me
okay.
think so.
Oh, okay, great. So I think, well, our immigration infrastructure in the U.S. needs to be modernized and reformed in general, and I would actually kind of encourage some updated guidance on the H-1B visas kind of program. I think they are good at finding highly skilled workers to fill jobs like doctors and engineers that the US kind of desperately needs as well. Before I talked about lower skilled labor jobs and the need for immigrants in those jobs in the US, but we also see this problem in a lot of high skilled work as well, and I think that visa in particular does a good job of finding people that we need to fill those jobs.
Yep.
So can you repeat the question? What
would be a good practice from the Polish experience in terms of labor market, in terms of migration, how to share with the rest of the world?
Leave it to the market, like the spontaneous order. The very reason that that migration was a very important force in Polish economic growth for last 10 years, since 2014, is that we had no rational, objective, and so on systems for migrants. Like we just let them to the country and let them work, and I would say that.
That you had a more laissez-faire or a laissez-passer, in fact, migration policy. Okay, I would say I leave it here for a second, because I might just open it up to the floor. And for all of you, you are encouraged to ask the more philosophical questions about open borders, or, of course, respective question on each of the 3 countries that we have present, or in case people are interested about Germany, also a very dire situation, I must say. But anyways, I see already questions there, and I'm looking in the room whether we have handheld microphones, which indeed we have. So over there in the back, that was the first person that I spotted. So please.
So Harrison, you cited Tyler Cohen before as someone who inspired your view of open borders. Would you agree with his view that open borders is not suitable for every country, Sweden being an example of one of those countries?
Sorry, would you mind just repeating that? I lost the first bit.
That you take your view of open borders from Tyler Cohen, that you're influenced by him. So that his view of open borders is that it's not suitable for every country, and Sweden being one of those examples, whereas it might be better for somewhere like the US.
Yeah, so, difficult one to answer. Morally speaking, I think rights are universal. I think any individual anywhere who wants to peacefully move to another piece of land where they want to own property, do business, live their lives in peace, should be able to do so. I think the economic benefits thereof for the immigrant and for the receiving country are the same, whether it's Sweden, America, or the Central African Republic. However, going more from the abstract and zeroing in on the kind of the political, cultural nuances of particular countries, yes, that's certainly true. The United States, I suppose, is one thing I would say in favor of the United States system, even if it's more cultural than policy, is that it is a nation that embraces a creed as the foundation of its country. Not a race, not blood, not soil, it's a creed. And I think that makes it probably best equipped of any country in the world to absorb new immigrants, and I think it's much to its credit. I think everybody else should be more like America. I don't have much time for apologia for European nationalism. I think European nationalism is an almost uniquely pernicious set of ideologies that have caused tremendous pain and suffering in various contexts across the world. Hungary, Britain, and Germany should be more like America. Unfortunately, I can't really just convince people of that. I can't click my fingers and make Hungary look more like America. However, I think that you can still, of course, have policies that are more adapted to the cultural context, to the economic context. But when, for example, I'm talking about the UK, we're talking about how easy it is to paint migrants as kind of parasites, as net takers, because they're competing for the fixed supply of housing, because so many of them are net fiscal drains rather than net fiscal contributors. The answer to that is to change the damn policies. Housing supply can't respond to demand because of the state, specifically the Town and Country Planning Acts of 1947 and 1974. Abolish them, tear them. We should do that anyway. Forget immigration. We should just do it anyway. The fact that our tax system is so geared towards wealth creators and towards the top top percentiles of the income distribution, we should change that anyway by reducing the overall burden of taxes and flattening it, right? So the UK context does make it more difficult to absorb lots of migrants at the moment. Change the damn policies. Culturally speaking, yes, that's a much more difficult thing to talk about. And yeah, look, Hungary isn't going to have open borders anytime soon. Britain isn't going to have it. No one's going to have open borders anytime soon. But incremental steps, liberalising our economies writ large and liberalising our immigration, maintaining a state that does its job of securing law and order well enough, that deports immigrant criminals, that puts domestic criminals in prison for a very long time when they commit certain acts. That is the important thing to do. And if we can get on that path, who knows what we're going to be talking about in 200 years. Maybe in 200 years, somebody will be sat here going, yes, open borders is good for every country, and I can back that up.
Yeah, and maybe to add, it's also, I mean, to save a little bit our American friends, like on the one hand, it's also more salient to some societies than to others. Like if there is an open borders policy in the United States, it's much more desirable. There's the Gallup poll, when you ask people where would you migrate in terms of an open border policy, an overwhelming majority of the respondents said that they would migrate to the US for the mere economic opportunities, the so-called location premium, while of course if like whatever, Belarus opens its borders, no front against my dear friends from Belarus, but like there might not be the migrant influx coming in the same way. So that's just to put that in context, I suppose. I had another question here in the front, and I think we have a question for sure for one more. So there was a hand raised somewhere there. Yeah, please, if the other hand is not around anymore. I hope the person is around then, so yeah, hope all is fine.
I mainly want to hear, because what we have seen, at least in Scandinavia and in Europe, is we had basically open borders, but I feel it was more like open borders of compassion, where we said, oh wait, you're refugees, you're fleeing persecution, war, poverty, and not necessarily coming up to get a job, but we were more like, oh, we need to be the welfare state of the world. So there is more, whereas yours is more like an open border of the market? So how would you say the differences is from the open border of compassion and the open border of the market? Is there a difference or is it the same?
I don't know who wants to take the question. Of course, I can say a couple of things about it, but any of you who wants to respond to it? I will give it a little bit of a couple of thoughts and then you can jump in if you want. I think the debate for most of the case, especially in classical liberal circles, is less about open borders is a human right, right? It's more, okay, if two people contract with each other, so the market logic, then we might have very good reasons to interject here. The state needs to present very good reasons to prevent two transacting parties from getting into that transaction. So what could that be? One could be tremendous effects on the labor market. Now we have seen empirically, not often very true. Most migration is actually complementary to the domestic labor force. Nevertheless, there are some losers, and we saw that with the MAGA movement. Then cultural issues. For example, there will be the cultural backlash. Migrants bring in undesirable values, let's say undemocratic, anti-liberty, what or not. Again, I think empirical literature is quite clear that it is not the case. And the third big argument was usually that it will lead to the populist backlash. And here I think the zeitgeist kind of shows us that this might be the strongest argument than interjecting and saying like for stability reasons we might prevent the logic here. So just to sum up, I think the argument on the especially classical liberal libertarian side in my books has never been an argument from a human rights perspective or more compassionate. It was always like, okay, people want to transact with each other. We might have very good reasons to prevent that transaction from happening, and most reasons were not very salient until kind of this real populist backlash emerged.
I have to agree with Sven. It's like when you have two consenting adults to do something, like why should somebody prevent them from doing it if they don't harm anybody else? So, and I always saw and I see migration as a mutually beneficial process, beneficial both for migrant and for native population. Of course, there are some losers in short term, but still, if you take the native population as a whole, the migration is beneficial for them too. And what I think is very unfortunate is that many people in many countries, like general public, see migration as something more humanitarian, and they don't see benefits from migration. It's like giving something to, we give them jobs or we give them taxpayers money, and they are here only to take our jobs and take our taxpayers money. So no, that's not true. The migrants come, of course it depends on the country, but in many cases they come to work hard, to earn their wages or run their businesses. They contribute to the prosperity of the country they came. They pay taxes and so on and so on. And we should focus on the benefits from migration and not see it as something humanitarian.
Yeah, I think I fully agree. Like also the framing here really matters. It is not compassion, right? Like to bring somebody to contribute to the domestic workforce, that's not necessarily compassion. It seems like the actual rational thing for a policymaker to do. And what kind of emerged out of our panel is too, that all of these different societies need migration for its future readiness of its labor market. And nevertheless, we see the political backlash to that. So anyone wants to add? I think Deanna.
Yeah. So I actually just spent the last couple of days in Sweden, in Stockholm, meeting with different members of parliament and their staff, and this conversation of migration came up time and time again when they were talking about their unemployment rates, how they were making strategic decisions about their unemployment insurance, and it seemed to me that, and again, this is an American's take on what a bunch of Swedes said, but that they kind of did open borders in a way with compassion in mind, and they had this huge influx of migration, and we quite literally had a staffer say to us, we don't have the language to talk about this. They weren't used to it, the way that the United States is much more able to absorb people who are different than other people. And I just think that that's something to kind of consider in this conversation is you can open borders with compassion, but policies may need to be tinkered in a way in order to absorb people into the economy without affecting the lives of people already living in that country in a super, super dramatic way.
Yeah, and Harrison, maybe the last words before I wrap it up, but yeah, I think we are ending with a very nice conclusion there, I must say, so please.
Yeah, so to take that example head on, like there's a real problem in Scandinavia in particular, in Sweden most notably, with the formation of quite violent, quite nasty kind of ethnic ghettos, and some cultural values being imported that are by any objective measure repugnant and wrong, particularly with attitudes towards women and towards religious minorities, towards Swedes exercising their inalienable right to burn a book, right? That's absolutely right. Now, I don't know what the answer is. There is some secret source in America very clearly that even when we don't really necessarily, other than colloquially, to talk about Irish people or Italian people as their own kind of ethnic segments anymore in America. I guess the one exception might be kind of like black nationalism a bit, is more kind of segmented, but that's a unique case. Now, I don't buy the idea that there's some genetic or deep cultural roots related problem with immigration. Germanic civilization gave us the worst governing ideology the world has ever seen. It has also given us Switzerland, right? East Asian civilization has given us two of the close behind Nazi Germany, the People's Republic of China and North Korea. It's also given us Taiwan and Japan. Institutions matter more, and there is something that Europe needs to do, whether it's about more consistent enforcement of the rule of law, whether it's about having more flexible economies that can absorb people economically, allow them to assimilate better into things like the labour market and not be seen as kind of parasites on the welfare state. There is something that we can do to better assimilate people from different cultures, and there is something we can do to encourage people who want to leave behind bad cultures to genuinely abandon them when they come here. There is something America does well, there is something the Europeans can do better, and I think there are tangible policy changes we can make. Are we prepared to make them? No. Do I think this is ever going to happen? No. But it's something we should absolutely aspire to, because it's morally right, and it could unlock tremendous economic benefits, the likes of which we haven't seen in a very long time.
Okay, then I have to say, we didn't know where this was going in the beginning, and now I reminded myself of a conversation that I recently had on geopolitics, where I said we have to just reframe our arguments. In the past, it has always been the abstract, happy, clappy international institutions, and now to get our own liberal ideals, we have to talk the pragmatic, almost deal-like logic. And I think that emerged here also. We don't give up on the open borders case, but the way we frame it is much more tied to the labor market itself instead of to other arguments for the open borders case. And that's something I will take away. I hope you enjoyed the panel. I certainly thank all our three experts, so give them a big round of applause. Thank you very much, everybody, for sticking around.